Let us continue with the politics of human rights. During the Cold War, proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America caused massive human sufferings and undermined human rights at serious scale. Both the United States and the Soviet Union intervened in conflicts by supporting local allies, often regardless of their human rights record. For example, in Central America, US backed regimes engaged in torture, assassination, and disappearances, while in Africa, Soviet backed governments restricted political freedom and silenced dissent. In these proxy wars, which was a main uh, feature of the post Cold War international politics, the language of human rights was sidelined. National interest and strategic rivalry took priority over justice and dignity. Millions of people were displaced, communities destroyed, and basic rights ignored. Humanitarian concerns were rarely addressed unless they served propaganda purposes. In Latin America, particularly in countries like Chile and Argentina, authoritarian governments suppressed opposition brutally, while Western governments continued to provide support as long as these regimes opposed communism. In turn, the Soviet Union justified repression in Eastern Europe as a defense against Western influence. The legacy of these proxy wars has been lasting mistrust. Many in the global south believed that neither superpower truly cared about human rights. Uh, rather they were only concerned about their dominance and control. This history demonstrates how political rivalry undermined the promise of universal protection. It also shows why the human rights debate is inseparable from global power struggles. While on the one hand, I have given you many examples how there was blatant violations of human rights. Human rights was also used as an ideology to justify their deeds or misdeeds. The actual purpose of using human rights and democracy as an ideology was to serve their own national interests. Somewhere or other, the superpowers were protecting their own national interests in the garb of democracy and human rights. Definitely, foreign policy is always an extension of the domestic policy. And whatever are the needs of the domestic politics, they shape the foreign policy of the nations. And definitely, ideology is always used as a garb, as a sophisticated way to justify their own national interest. One of the most important lessons in human rights debates is that states prioritize national interest over universal principles. For Western nations, human rights were frequently promoted when they aligned with political or strategic goals, but ignored when they conflicted with them. For example, allies' violations were overlooked while rivals were harshly criticized. Developing nations noticed that these inconsistencies and resisted what they saw as interference in their sovereignty. They argued that Western powers used human rights as a tool to maintain control or extend influence. For them, sovereignty and self determination were equally important rights, and they opposed external pressure framed as concern for human rights. Definitely, gone were the days when the superpowers of the world, like Great Britain, France, Portugal, etc., etc., uh, used armies or armed conflicts and even the theories of white men's burdens to control completely the countries of Africa and Asia. That was the period of imperialism when democracy has not yet made its appearance on the world scenario. These countries, which were captured by the imperial powers, were still feudal and monarchical. and they had no idea of democracy. But today's countries are well aware of democracy, human rights, and sovereignty, and therefore it was not possible for the Western countries to control them in the same manner as they did during the period of imperialism. So now they use the sophisticated tools of human rights and democracy to control the sovereignty or to intervene in the internal matters of the Afro-Asian countries. The tension between ideals and interest is clearly visible. While states speak the language of universality, in practice they follow calculations of power, security, and economics. This does not mean that human rights are meaningless, but it shows that their enforcement is uneven and shaped by political realities. Moreover, this usage of human rights as a tool of diplomacy carries a silver lining. It created global consciousness for human rights, it created global consciousness for democracy, and definitely states were forced to think why we are talking about human rights, child rights, women rights. At least they created a consciousness both at the global and at the national level. So, trickling down to the local level also. Understanding the balance between principles and interests is essential. Human rights remain a powerful moral framework, but their credibility suffers when applied selectively. To strengthen universality, states must work towards consistent and fair enforcement beyond national interest, which seems to be a remote possibility because still the international politics is governed by the realist school, which motivates the states to protect their self interest, their national interest. If we do not consider human rights beyond national interest, human rights are at risk of being seen as a political slogan rather than a universal promise. The human rights debate has also been shaped by questions of cultural superiority. Western nations often assume that their liberal values, such as individual freedom, secularism, and gender equality, were universal and should be applied everywhere. Many non Western countries, uh, however, resisted this assumption, viewing it as cultural arrogance and superimposition of the Western values. They argued that collective duties, community values, and traditions were equally important. For example, in many Asian and African societies, the emphasis on family and community obligations sometimes conflict with Western idea of individual freedom. Similarly, women's rights become a contested area. While Western models emphasized strict equality, some non Western countries argued that their cultural or religious practices define gender roles differently. And they look upon women entirely in a different way. This tension created suspicion that human rights were being used as a mask for cultural imperialism. Non Western leaders often claimed that the West was imposing its worldwide view rather than respecting diversity. On the other hand, some authoritarian regimes misuse the language of culture to justify oppression, denying women and minorities basic freedoms. The challenge lies in creating genuine dialogue rather than imposition. True universality does not mean uniformity but requires respect for diversity. It means finding ways to uphold dignity and equality without dismissing cultural values. Without this balance, human rights risk being rejected as foreign rather than embraced as a shared human heritage. The tension between universalism and relativism forces us to ask whether human rights can be both global and sensitive to diversity. Universalism insists that dignity, equality, and freedom apply to everyone. Relativism stresses that traditions, cultures, and contexts must shape how rights are applied. Neither extreme is sustainable on its own. A balanced approach begins with agreeing on core values such as the right to life, freedom from torture, and equality before the law. These should never be compromised. At the same time, flexibility is needed in how societies implement rights. For example, education is a universal right, but schooling systems may vary across societies. Gender equality is universal, but strategies for achieving it can respect cultural context while upholding dignity. I recall how colonial rulers in India destroyed the local education system. According to Macaulay, if Britain wants to uh, continue its rule over India, then it need to destroy the indigenous system of education. That was Gurukul, and they created convents with the offer that convent education would be given government jobs. And gradually, people started quitting Gurukuls, rejecting Gurukuls, while Gurukuls give a comprehensive education. They are a beautiful amalgamation of traditions, cultures, as well as modern education. So, you see that there is a full conspiracy going on behind destroying the cultural identity and diversity of Afro Asian countries. International treaties already allow some flexibility through reservations, but this must not become an excuse for denying essential freedoms. Dialogue between culture is key. Instead of imposing one model, society should share experience and adopt global principles to local needs. Definitely, outdated traditions, customs, and practices uh, justified in the name of religion and old age cultural values should be rejected, opening the way to empowerment and access to equal rights to each and every member of the society. But at the same time, in the name of universality, we should not destroy the indigenous positive cultural practices of our society. For example, family system, joint family system, gurukuls, worshipping the nature, respecting the nature, etc. Now, this balance ensures inclusiveness and avoids alienation. It makes human rights stronger by showing they are not foreign imports but adaptable values rooted in human dignity. In this way, universality becomes real while respecting diversity. One of the greatest challenges to human rights is global inequality. While principles claim universality, reality shows deep division between rich and poor nations. Wealthy countries in the north enjoy advanced healthcare, education, and technology, while many in the south face poverty, hunger, and weak institutions. For the global south, poverty itself is a violation of dignity. People cannot enjoy political freedom unless they have economic security in terms of food, water, shelter, basic health facilities. This is why the right to development becomes central in their demands. They argued that without economic justice, other rights remain empty promises. The West often prioritized political freedoms while downplaying economic inequality. Structural global rules, such as trade barriers, debt burdens, and control of technology, often favored the North. This reinforced the South's belief that the global order was unfair. Human rights cannot be fully realized without addressing inequality. Development, fair trade, and redistribution are essential to make universality meaningful. Moreover, when we say that democracy is a prerequisite for human rights do not exist in vacuum, and we need to have democratic political setup. And we look into modern history of rights, or rather history of rights starting with modern period that ushered the wave of democracy, constitutional government. Democracy is meaningless unless we have a balance between civil political rights and social economic rights. Political democracy and economic democracy should go hand in hand in if we want to really have a comprehensive regimen of human rights. The challenge is to integrate social justice with civil and political freedom, ensuring that no set of rights is ignored. Then only we can have a true democracy, and true democracy, in only a true democracy, can true human rights survive. Global inequality shows that human rights are not just about protecting individuals from abuse, but also about creating conditions where everyone can live with dignity and without fear. Fear of any kind, fear of want, and any other kind of fear. Without tackling poverty and oppression together, universality remains incomplete. One needs to feel safe and secure, both in political terms, economic terms, and social terms also. Another contested issue is the relationship between human rights and state sovereignty. Sovereignty means that states have supreme authority over their own territory and people. Traditionally, this means that outsiders could not interfere in domestic matters. However, after the 20th century, many argued that sovereignty cannot be used to shield governments that oppress their citizens. The principles of the principle of the responsibility to protect R2P emerged to justify intervention when states commit mass atrocities like genocide. Western nations often supported this idea, arguing that human rights must come before state power. Yet, many in the global south saw responsibility to protect as a new excuse for powerful nations to interfere in weaker ones, as and when they desire. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, justified partly in the name of freedom and rights, deepen these suspicions. Yes, of course, the contradictions lies that when there is political interference in the name of R2P, why not there is an interference, such sense of responsibility to address poverty and underdevelopment and illiteracy in global south? For developing countries, sovereignty remains essential for stability and independence. They fear that without it, stronger nations will dominate under the cover of human rights. At the same time, victims of mass violence cannot be left helpless in the name of sovereignty. Challenge is finding a balance where sovereignty protects independence but does not excuse oppression. Human rights must be defended without turning intervention into a tool of power politics. The intervention of the West should not only be political or to usher wars or proxy wars, but the interference should also be for economic development, to take care of the poor in the south, to build the institutions of economic development, to address the issues of poverty, illiteracy, and the causes behind child labor, the causes behind discrimination against women. So, if intervention is both ways, economic also, then obviously there will be no doubt on the intention. Unfortunately, the intervention is only political, to usher wars and proxy wars, and not to take care of the economic needs and requirements of the poor in the southern hemisphere. Globalization has reshaped the human rights debate. On the positive side, it spreads awareness rapidly through communication technologies. NGOs and global campaigns, ideas of rights reached people worldwide, giving them tools to demand justice. Social media and global news allowed quick mobilization of public opinion. At the same time, globalization increased inequality and exploitation. Multinational corporations sometimes ignored workers' rights, paying low wages and denying safety standards in poorer nations. Environmental destruction by global industries violated the rights of communities to health and security. Digital globalization brought new dilemmas. While the internet created a space for free expression, it also enabled surveillance, censorship, and manipulation. Privacy became a human rights concern. Similarly, global trade rules often favored the North, leaving developing countries at a disadvantage. Even today, most of the developing countries are unable to create their own algorithms, and we are often purchasing these algorithms from the West. That means we are allowing them an access to all sorts of data in our country. Globalization expanded the scope of human rights beyond states. It raised questions about the responsibility of corporations, international organizations, and even digital platforms. Rights were no longer just about governments, but about global systems. Thus, globalization both empowered and threatened human rights. It created new opportunities for solidarity, but also exposed its structural inequalities and the unwillingness of the West to again transfer technology to the developing world. Technology in AI, technology in data protection, creating algorithms, etc. etc. Human rights movements must now address not only the local abuse but also global forces shaping people's lives. Now, till now, the people in the South or the countries of the South are frustrated about the basic human rights violations of like right to development. They are still struggling with poverty, illiteracy, uh, protecting childhood, protecting women's life. We are the globalization and the IT revolution has posed new threats of survival and have opened up new ways of hijacking the sovereignty of the countries in the south because again they need the same kind of technology, they need same kind of uh, they need same kind of you know technological expertise which they are in fact lacking and are looking towards west for these. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch documented violations and raised awareness globally. Local NGOs worked within communities to empower marginalized groups and adopt global norms to local realities. NGOs often served as watchdogs, pressurizing governments to respect commitments and highlighting abuses. Their reports provided evidence for international action. Civil society campaigns helped create treaties, influenced laws, and supported victims. However, the NGOs and civil society have also been used as institution to intervene in the domestic affairs and to control the sovereignty of the states by the Western world. NGOs, civil societies face criticism. Many were accused of bias because they relied on funding from the Western governments, and therefore, critics argued that they promoted foreign agendas under the banner of rights. Authoritarian governments often restricted NGOs, accusing them of interference and supporting and extending the Western agenda. Despite these challenges, NGOs remain vital. They give voice to the voiceless and connect local struggles with global attention. Without them, many abuses would remain hidden. The challenge is to ensure that NGOs remain independent and accountable while continuing their essential role. Civil society proves that human rights are not just about states or treaties, but also about grassroots activism. Change often begins from below, and NGOs help, and civil societies and NGOs help transform universal principles into real protections for people. The end of the Cold War in early 90s created hope that the world could finally unite around human rights. In 1993, the Vienna Conference reaffirmed that all rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. This was a milestone in overcoming East West divisions. Yet, new challenges quickly emerged. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda and the wars in the Balkans exposed the failure of the international community to act decisively. The responsibility to protect doctrine was introduced, but interventions remained selective and often shaped by political interest. Globalization added new dimensions to debate, including climate change, mass migration, terrorism, and digital surveillance. These issues showed that human rights were evolving and had to address global problems, not just national abuses. At the same time, double standards persisted as usual. Western nations intervened in some crises while ignoring others. This selective approach undermined credibility. Nevertheless, human rights institutions grew stronger, and the new treaties expanded protection. We created a number of national human rights institutions also, which are called NHRIs, to give further boost to human rights. For example, Human Rights Act of India, passed in 1993, provided for the creation of National Human Rights Commission and State Human Rights Commission to take care of the human rights of the people, besides court, judiciary, NGOs, and civil societies. NHRC was entrusted with a large number of functions, right from protecting human rights to monitoring public institutions, taking care of the weak and the vulnerable, or like mental asylums and jails and government hospitals, rehab centers, to even creating a pro human rights culture through education and research. We'll deal with NHRIs later on. The post Cold War era shows both progress and contradiction. While the idea of universality is more widely accepted, practice still reflects inequality, power politics, and inconsistency. This debate highlighted how the debate on human rights expanded and deepened after the Cold War. We saw that rights are not just legal principles but also political, cultural, and economic struggles. They are universal in spirit but contested in practice. We examined how development, children's rights, and women's rights brought new dimensions, created a concept of group rights. Cultural relativism challenged universality, while Western double standards and selective enforcements weakened trust. Proxy wars and national interest showed that power often overrules principles. Universality versus cultural relativism not only started a new debate, but it put pressure on both the sides. It put pressure on the West also, but it put pressure on the countries of Africa and Asia also to preserve culture but respect universal human rights also. On the West, it put a pressure that respect for universal human rights is important, but cultures are also equally important. Simultaneously, globalization, NGOs, and civil societies opened new possibilities for promoting rights. They were the new institutions taking care of the human rights, besides United Nations, regional institutions, etc., etc., and the state, of course. They connected local struggles with global awareness and raised questions about responsibilities beyond states. The post Cold War era demonstrated both progress and contradictions. While the Vienna Declaration reaffirmed universality, selective interventions and global inequalities showed that much remains unresolved. The human rights debate is therefore ongoing. It is not about choosing between the West and the non West, but about building genuine universality, a genuine human rights regimen that respects diversity and ensures justice. Human rights remain a shared hope, but their realization depends on fairness, consistency, and global cooperation. Thank you.